Good afternoon, everyone. It's so lovely to have you all here for our Women's History Month event at St. Anne and the Holy Trinity Church and Pro Cathedral. We are a parish of the Episcopal Diocese of Long Island. Some of you know we've been here a very long time. In fact, I was thinking our vintage, or the vintage of this building, is about the vintage of the Brooklyn Women's Exchange in this neighborhood. We'll be talking more facts and details as the event continues. I just want to thank members of this parish who have, over many years now, committed to lifting up women in our neighborhood, in the country, and in the world, initially and for quite a long time, with a program that we called Unsung Heroines, at which members of the parish made presentations about the lives and accomplishments of particularly unknown or not known enough women in fields far and wide. Last year, as we were sort of feeling an initial phase of coming out of the pandemic, we decided that we weren't quite ready to engage that program in full, but we were ready to host a single speaker. And we invited the architect of record for this parish, a woman named Lisa Easton, to make a presentation about women in architecture. And she did a tremendous job. She leads an architecture firm called Lisa Easton and Associates, and it's one of the few women-owned architectural firms in the country, certainly in the city. And because she's our architect and has been working on projects to do with this building for many, many years, she pivoted to a wonderful presentation about the building and the work that she had been doing and is still doing, and we were so grateful. This year we decided once again to host a single presenter, and I am so thrilled that when the invitation was extended to the Brooklyn Women's Exchange, the answer was yes, we will be your presenter for this year's Women's History Month event at St. Anne's. And it turns out that our speaker today is a fellow Episcopalian and friend, Martha Foley, who's the archivist and historian for the Women's Exchange, and she'll be introduced in a moment by Anne Orajema, who's the president of the Women's Exchange. And I just want to say for the record that we did not invite you here because your husband, Claude Scales, had made us a featured sort of institution of the year for 2022 in the Brooklyn Heights blog. I promise that's not why this is happening. That is pure coincidence. But I'm grateful for that honor as well. It is an honor to have you here. I have a whole lot of questions, but I'm going to leave them for after the presentation. We'll try to save a few minutes so that there's a chance to engage Martha and possibly you and anyone else who's here from the Women's Exchange. If you are here from the Women's Exchange or a Women's Exchange listserv, welcome. We're so delighted that you are here, and we are your neighbors, and we look forward to a rich new iteration, renewed relationship with you now that you've come back to Montague Street. I, by the way, am Canon John Denaro. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm the rector of this wonderful church and feel grateful for that every day. We do all kinds of things here, starting with worship, but we try so much to make this a community center, a community institution, a community commons, and you're helping us do that today. So without further ado, I welcome Anne Orajema and ask you to welcome her too.
Welcome, thank you. First of all, thank you to Canon Denaro and for the committee who decided that the Brooklyn Women's Exchange was a place that they could ask to have a guest speaker. So thank you for that. Thank you for those who came out to listen. And thank you for all the members of the Brooklyn Women's Exchange who are here to support Martha.
Thank you.
When the invitation came to Elizabeth, our shop manager, she contacted me and said, Canon Denaro came to the shop and wanted to know whether we had someone who could speak. And I said, hold on a second, I know exactly who that person should be. It's got to be Martha Foley. Martha Foley is our archivist, she's our historian, and she tells really interesting stories. So, without 1 second doubt in my mind, I contacted Martha. She got very excited, very happy, but humble. She was like, thank you. Thank you for thinking of me. And that's Martha. She's unassuming, but she's brilliant. She has a talent that really needs to be admired and respected. Martha started out was born and raised in Lynn, Massachusetts, and that will become evident to you when you hear her endearing accent as she speaks, because she is a true Bostonian New Englander. She was educated in Boston. She went to Emmanuel College, where she received her bachelor's degree in art history and art design.
History and art.
History and art, okay, thank you. And then she went on to go to graduate school at NYU with a graduate degree in history. She moved to Brooklyn Heights in 1991. She married her husband, Claude Scales, who is the Brooklyn Heights blogger, as you have been told. And they have lived in Brooklyn Heights ever since. Martha's history with the Brooklyn Women's Exchange dates back to about 1999, Martha thinks. She told me that she keeps finding minutes with her name on them. So it could go deeper, but at least it's that far. She's an accomplished archivist. Her resume was heavy. When I downloaded it from her, it was pages of her accomplishments. So she's an applauded, real, true archivist, historian. She sits on boards of directors for historical societies. She's done lots and lots of work with the history of many places, including the Brooklyn Public Library, the New York Public Works, some temples in Park Slope. So let's just put it this way, Martha knows what she's doing and she knows what she's talking about. We are very, very privileged to have Martha be our historian at the Brooklyn Women's Exchange. Martha is going to tell you about our history, which dates back to 1854. So it's almost 170 years old. I am not 170 years old, but I could go for that. So without saying much else, I would like to just say this. Martha is like a moth to a flame when you tell her about something about history, and she can weave a story like no one else I have ever met. She's fascinating. She's dazzling when she talks about history, and she brings it to life in a way that no one else can. So I welcome Martha as our guest speaker. I thank her from the bottom of our hearts at the Brooklyn Women's Exchange for being Martha and being the historian and archivist that she is.
Yikes. What a tough act to follow. I hope not to bore anybody. When I first moved to Brooklyn Heights in 1991 and was exploring the neighborhood, I noticed this wonderful shop on Pierpont Street that had the most attractive things in the windows. And it was just amazing to me that I could never get there when it was open. It was always closed, no matter when I went there. I began to call it the Brigadoon store. Like, was it ever going to open? And then when it did open, I was so enchanted with the contents of the shop. There's so many beautiful handmade items that you wouldn't get anywhere else. Where are you going to get a handmade baby christening gown for a girl or a boy? They will customize this gender for you. Pottery, earrings, I mean, you name it. The Women's Exchange has all these wonderful things, and they're carrying on a tradition that started 169 years ago. Everybody who is a consignor in the shop, and I'll have to say in their new location, that we're open more than they were when I moved here in 1991. Thanks to more volunteers, they're open now from noon to 6 every day except Monday, and on Thursday they're open till 7 p.m., which is a miracle, actually. So the Women's Exchange is carrying on a tradition that started in 1854. In 1854, I don't know, this building started to be built. There was a huge building boom in American cities in 1854. And according to my sources, Brooklyn was the second or third largest city in the United States at that time. I know President Lincoln came to visit here. It wasn't just to hang out with Henry Ward Beecher, he wanted votes. He really came because Brooklyn rivaled Manhattan as an urban city. And with the urban cities, besides the beautiful houses that we see in our neighborhood that were built at that time, there was a tremendous amount of poverty. And there was a great deal of financial instability. I read that some families were one person away from poverty. If the person that supported you got sick, died, had a reverse, lost their job, you would be plunged into dire poverty. Where was the money going to come from? So there were also, in Brooklyn, Brooklyn is called the city of churches, not for nothing, especially here in the Heights. A number of people in the churches were very concerned about this, and women got together. They were very well organized. They had a plan in mind. They agreed to form the Brooklyn Female Employment Society because they wanted to help two groups of people. They wanted to help their contemporaries who were experiencing financial insecurity. For example, like the banks that failed today. If this was 1854 and the banks failed, you'd be out of luck. Anybody that had any money in there, you'd never see the money again. Probably you'd never see those guys again. And then there'd be another bank tomorrow, and the next week that bank would fail. And railroads, you would have stock in a railroad that was doing fine today, somebody would take it over, and you would have nothing the next day. So the idea was, how could they help their friends who were middle class and could not go out to work, who had financial reverses, or they had a sick husband, a dead husband, who knows, whatever their problems were. They needed to make money. And so they thought of a discreet way to do that was to give them work that they could do from home and sell it. And so nobody would know where the money was coming from. Nobody would know who made this particular item. They also wanted to help women who needed to support their families, who were from working class, who the biggest skill at that time were women could be seamstresses. That was, the beginning of the sewing machine revolution was about that time, but not everybody could afford a sewing machine, not everyone had a sewing machine, and there was a tremendous need for textiles. Homes today, you don't even think about it. We have access to so many inexpensive textiles, but people needed sheets, they needed tablecloths, babies needed clothes, invalids needed clothes. Just think, there were no rubber pants in those days. You needed lots and lots of infant clothes. If you were sick, you had no antibiotics, you'd be sick for months, you'd wear out your clothes and getting better. So there was a market. So they formed this organization in 1854, and they had 11 men who were their advisors. And next slide, please. Can I have the next slide? And this leads me to this slide. These are the archives that were found when we moved the Women's Exchange from 55 Pierpont Street to Montague Street. This is all amazing material here. And the reason I'm showing it to you is because the official collection of the Women's Exchange is in the Center for Brooklyn History. They have 3 boxes of archives, which I've been through. But the mother lode of stuff and the most interesting, fascinating stuff was found in this collection. Next slide, please. For example, the second annual report of the Society is in the basement of the Women's Exchange now. And that's where we learned that the founders got these 11 men, it had to be men, to buy property at 65 Court Street, which is now, I think, the Board of Ed, and they set out to, with their business. They brought in, their idea was to hire women and put them to work and to give them an income. So they had people there who made clothes for a lot of the social the charitable organizations, which were not, or I want to say social service organizations, but they weren't called that. They were charitable organizations who needed, there were a lot of free kindergartens in this neighborhood, there were a lot of hospitals. Henry Ward Beecher was scraping people off the pavement of the waterfront and sobering up the men and getting the families in shape, and they needed clothes. They needed children's underwear, they needed dresses, they needed shirts, they needed sheets, they needed all kinds of things. Henry Ward Beecher, which I don't have, you want the next slide, please? During the Civil War, the exchange really got going. They had over 500 people working at home and 500 people working in different shifts at 65 Court Street. Now, I don't think it was a factory at all. They hired people to oversee. They said they paid women in the Civil War $4.50 a week, which was an amazing salary to make clothes. They had contracts from the U.S. government. This is a contract, this is a receipt from the Sanitary Commission. The Sanitary Commission was an organization of civilians that set up to monitor and run hospitals and care for the wounded during the Civil War. And the epicenter of the Sanitary Commission was New York, and right next to New York was Brooklyn. So this is a receipt for, you can barely see it, I'm sorry, this is what the original looked like. It was 258 flannel drawers and 28 shirts. That's only one receipt. Henry Ward Beecher ordered something like 1,000 pairs of men's drawers, and the Army's contract, it included, besides flannel shirts, it included bed rolls or bed sacks. I have no idea what that meant, but it kept everybody busy. And the Women's Exchange was really so successful at handing up, they got money from charities, they got money from the government, and they handed it out. They said they had 20 women who visited homes to distribute funds to people who worked for them. And in 1866, after the Civil War, they opened up a sewing school in their 65 Court Street quarters. They had a store. They said the store was for exhibition, so you could see what kind of things they could make, and people could drop things off, and people could pick things up from the store, and they would sell things. So next slide, please. At some point, they moved to 93 Court Street, and that building still survives. That building was where they had their operations. They had their sewing school. This was all run by women. It was mind-boggling to see how many women there were involved in the organization. I thought, like, oh, maybe a few people would stand out. Like, hundreds of people stand out. You could probably write a whole dissertation on the women that ran the organization from the name. Mrs. Alfred T. White is one of them. The Pierponts, anybody was involved in this organization. So next slide, please. So there was another organization that did similar, it was somewhat similar to the Women's Exchange, called the Women's Work Exchange and Decorative Arts Society of Brooklyn. They were at 122 Atlantic Street, but shortly after this 1889 annual report, which is also in the basement of the Women's Exchange, they moved to Montague Street. And can you check the next slide, please? The rules. So this is the rules that they did not deal with coarse sewing, which we would call like children's underwear, bedrolls, sheets, necessary household linens. This group was they just sold decorative items made by women, and I have to read you if you can't, because I'm sorry that it's so small there, but there was a caveat. You could submit things here, and and my phone won't work. This is sort of the basis of a lot of things that are still today. We still have consigners. Consigners kept 10% of the goods. They sold food, they sold jellies, they sold jams, they sold sweet things. But the key issue that I want to say is that they do not accept work from gentlewomen whose circumstances do not make it necessary for them to dispose of their handiwork. So that meant if you just had made nice things and wanted to sell them, forget about it. But something like this is what young ladies were taught to make. This is a lovely crocheted table runner. I mean, people in the Victorian era, if you look at the pictures, had tons of textiles everywhere. They had textiles on their textiles, and somebody needed to supply it. And the next slide, please. Yeah, and the Needlework Society just catered to that market. They charged more. There's a comparison in one of the books that I have, the book on women's exchanges. There was a comparison between what Bloomingdale's was charging for clothes and what the Needlework Society was charging, and they were a little more. You paid more because you were contributing to somebody's household. You were helping somebody make a living. And there were other exchanges all over the country. If you do a search on newspapers.com, you'll find every little town in Long Island had a similar operation, and all across the country. In 1921, the Needlework Society on Montague Street wasn't doing so well. They did not have, I mean, their business was okay, but they didn't have an endowment, and they weren't sure how they were going to pay their rent going forward. So the Employment Society, which was going great guns, invited them to share their space at 93 Court Street. And they combined forces, and that's when the Female Employment Society really went into the business that we see today, because they sold food, they sold, as I said, decorative items. You could order curtains, you could order clothing made, you could order just about anything that had to do with a textile, and somebody there would make it for you. This went on until at some point, 93 Court Street was sold. I think next slide, please. You can see the things that they made. If I could get my phone to work, I could tell you what they were to give you an idea. Yeah, I can do it. Good, good, good. Articles of clothing, fancy articles, work bags, shopping bags, all sorts of infants wear, fine lingerie, lampshades, table and household linen, aprons, heavy underwear, household towels, cakes, pies, jellies, jams, cookies, candy, salted nuts, baskets and boxes of delicacies for prizes, delicacies for invalids, orders taken for marking and hemming of household items, infants and children's wear, lingerie, hospital and Red Cross work, sandwiches, boxes of goodies for school and college, jellies and jams put up during the summer months for delivery. But, hold on. Again, you had to play by the rules. The day for the distribution of work in the coursework department is Tuesday from 10 to 11 a.m. The day for receiving in the exchange and the food shop is Wednesday. Now, not everybody's work was accepted. You had, as today, their work was juried, and as today, I understand that consigners pay $5 to participate in the Women's Exchange. This goes back to like the Civil War. Now, how people in the Civil War came up with $5 if you needed money so that you could make money, I don't know. But I imagine that wealthy people contributed to that, and so these people could be certified as worthy of getting help from the exchange and submitting their goods, which the exchange took 10% from. So, next slide, please. All right, so things were going great guns in the 20s. People had money. This is a newspaper clipping that shows that they invited 800 people to tea. Unsuccessful organizations do not invite 800 people to tea. So this is, they were doing very well. Social welfare agencies, charities, hospitals, government, people were asking them to make goods. And then what happens after 1929? We have the financial crash. Also, I think what was catching up with the Women's Exchange was that you had cheaply made goods that were flooding the market, and it was a lot cheaper for a hospital to go somewhere where there was a factory to get their textiles. So that caused them to rethink things. So can we have the next slide? So just before the Depression, They had a few social service agencies that they made things for, and my friend Kay very thoughtfully included, this is a Hoover dress, the types of articles for sale you can't read this, it says, "Dear Miss Pierpoint, this is the final list of garments to be sent." This is going out to, says, to Kingston Hospital, 21 dresses as of ages 6 and 4, 21 pairs of bloomers. To the visiting nurses, I thought this was really interesting, 14 Hoover dresses, that's a Hoover dress, 7 slips, 7 pairs bloomers, 6 dresses age 4, 6 pair bloomers age 4, 6 infant packets, 6 infant caps, 2 infant shirts. And it's signed by the lady that was the supervisor of the sewing department at the Women's Exchange. So this is what they made in the, behind the shop. And meanwhile, the shop had jams and jellies and candies and beautiful, beautiful tapestries and examples of embroidery and other fine things. So this was great. Next slide. The next slide is a letter from the Children's Aid Society, just as things were winding down. I love this letter, and I think I had it in the shop. I think, Elizabeth, you may have had it at your desk. This is such an amazing letter. I have to read it to you. It's from the Children's Aid Society, June 4th, 1934. It says, "On behalf of the many dependent, neglected, and disabled children in our care, we want you to know how much we appreciate the many excellent garments recently contributed to our society by your fine organizations. We wish we could convey to you the delight and happiness of the children in receiving this much-needed clothing. It is decided aid to their morale, keeping them considerably, helping them to adjust themselves to a new environment, they having largely come from homes that have been broken through desertion, illness, and death." And it goes on to say how happy these children were to get clothes that nobody else had worn, that these were clothes that were their first new clothes. And so I think that's such a great letter. I think the Women's Exchange they paid seamstresses to make clothes. If they didn't have someone to buy them, they donated them to these organizations. So in 1936, next slide, this was like the cusp of big change. All right, in 1936, they changed their name to the Women's Exchange of Brooklyn. And that consolidated the Needlework Society, the Female Employment Society, the Decorative Arts. It was the whole Megillah in one big place. So everybody was on board for that. At the same time, in the rest of the world, there was this is where the Federation of Women's Exchange was organized. And exchanges like ours all joined together. They had an annual meeting in different places, and they would talk about their problems. How could they consolidate? How could they, just like today, who are the best consigners? Who makes the best smocked baby clothes? Who makes the best caramel candies? And they talked about what did they do about their financial problems? Were there ways of approaching banks? Were there ways of approaching landlords? They just had a lot of common ground. So the Federation of Women's Exchange, I don't have a slide for them, was organized at that time. Can I have the next slide? Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, it's coming. Oh, good. All right, so this is the first time I've done this, so you have to forgive me. I didn't know how this was going to work. This is definitely a work in progress. But I thought it was really interesting to see the different types of goods that they were selling. After 1936, basically they had to pension off. They had several charitable funds that were left to them for the benefit of poor needlewomen. So some of the workers who labored for the women's, I shouldn't say labored, but yeah, they did labor for the Female Employment Society, had pensions that wealthy people had given so that they could be well off in their old age. So around 1936, they stopped making clothes. The course groups stopped, and the Women's Exchange didn't do anything like that except special orders like we do today. If somebody needs something with a baby's name on it or a special color, they catered to special orders. But I thought that it would be interesting to see, if I can read this, I'm just going to read some of the things that they sold in the shop. Oh, you had very fine work on special orders, which I just talked about. Boutonnieres, old glass, baby knitted articles, lingerie, silk, baby sacks, initialing on linens, baby horse reins, crocheting to order, toy animals, braided rugs, baby knitted things, all kinds of sewing, curtains, etc., baby caps, embroidered blouses, pin cushions, etc., quilting on bedspreads, quilts, sewing bags, linen, Italian linens, hand-painted trays, baby capes, pin cushions, Chinese novelties, odd jobs, mending of linens. They did a lot of repair work, I noticed in the records for people. Knitted bed jackets, knitted goods to order, hand-tooled leather goods. So clearly they bought some, well, this is people who supplied it. They, like today, they had some things that were wholesale, but the majority of their work was selling items for people who lived in the neighborhood so that they could augment their incomes. And the food, I'm always interested in food, so I'm sorry, you have to bear with me for a minute while I read the types of food. And I read that they had many events were catered by them for like the Brooklyn Horticultural Society, which later became the Botanic Garden. So organizations used them to cater their events, but they made cake, caramels, nuts, bread rolls, cakes, birthday cakes, jellies, pickles, cookies, sandwiches, mints, calf's foot jelly, which was mentioned in the Brownstoner Post, pickled spiced peaches, Swedish cookies. So they had quite a repertoire. At this point, they also moved to a location that was more central to where things were happening in Brooklyn. They moved to 151 Pierpont Street, which is now part of that monolithic building on Pierpont Street. And the reason they moved there, I think probably, they sold 93 Court Street. But you have to understand, before Robert Moses came about, all the trolleys from Brooklyn and Manhattan began and ended at where Cadman Plaza is now. Where the War Memorial is now, it was a huge terminus for streetcars, elevated trains. So there was lots and lots of business. And also, the neighborhood was much more congested. Robert Moses came in and did slum clearance of acres. I mean, look where Concord Village is. Look at where Camden Park is. Imagine that was all full of brownstones like the rest of the neighborhood, which Robert Moses identified as slums. And that's also when he decided he was going to put the BQE down Hicks Street, right straight through the middle of Hicks Street. So there was, the neighborhood was in turmoil. Robert Moses was churning up the place, and what had once been a very lucrative place for them to have their shop slowly wasn't. It wasn't. During World War II, I don't have any slides from World War II. You'll be probably relieved to hear. But the organization faced a lot of challenges during World War II. And World War II is when they stopped having hired help in the shop. They had one manager and a bookkeeper, but they had volunteers. And the people who were on the board, the managers, were supposed to be sign up for volunteer at least one shift a month. And if you couldn't make your shift, you could pay for them to hire. They had people that they could hire to take your shift. But you had to give them adequate notice. And the Junior League gave credit to people who wanted to work in the shop. And I'd have to say around World War II, there began to be, things weren't going as well as it had been for the exchange. They continued, they had bridge parties, they had teas, they had coffees, they had special events in the shop, they had special events at the casino, they had special events at every church in the neighborhood. And from the St. George to the Bossert, the newspapers are full of events that they had to raise funds. At the end of 1949, it became clear that their shop was not going to make it in this location. So they were advised to sell the building. They had paid $70,000 for it in the late 1920s. They sold it at a loss for $30,000, which I thought was shocking. But that just showed you how the values, real estate values, change in a minute. And I'm sure if they waited a few years, they would have gotten twice as much or even more for it. So that was very sad. So they sold their building, and they weren't exactly sure what they were going to do. So oddly enough, our address today is it 136? 137. Well, they were at 136 Montague Street, where Variety Mart is now, from 1950 to 1953. And then their next move, next slide, their next move was to 76 Montague Street, where the Cat Cafe is now. That was the Women's Exchange from 1953 until 1980. and they had a celebration. They also, in this time when they moved, the Brooklyn Heights Association joined them, as did the Junior League. At this shop, they depended more on volunteer. It became more, the shop that they had, it must have been really charming. Next slide, please. We don't have many images of it, but we have a painting in the shop, and this is one of the images that was used for publicity. They showed examples of some of the fine sewing in 1980. In 1980, the shop was sold as part of, it was a real estate auction to behold. The estate of the people who owned it, the James family, sold it, and it was supposed to be a closed bid auction. So all the banks got behind the Women's Exchange, and they had a pretty good amount of money to enter into the auction. But at the last minute, a real estate speculator outbid everybody and ended up with the building, which he subsequently flipped. I mean, we're all shocked. He flipped it and sold it to somebody who immediately evicted the Women's Exchange, even though they had secured space in the old Pierpont Hotel, which was being renovated by HUD, Housing Urban Development. They had space, and they told him, they told his lawyers, they said, look, we're planning to move when the space is renovated. He didn't care. He was not a nice guy. He's still around, unfortunately. But, so the exchange, well, I've had conversations with him because he's a guy that owns that anchor that used to be in front of where the Cat Cafe is, and he wants to put it in the promenade, but the Parks Department is like, forget it, no way. But so he's had conversations with my husband to try to raise public support for it, which that hasn't happened, thank God. But in any case, so the exchange moved into this retail space at 55 Pierpont, and it was a great space. It was bigger than 76 Montague. They were very happily there for the next, I don't know, 1980 to 2022, yes. HUD turned the organization of the building over to the Catholic Charities. It was Section 8 housing, as you know, for elderly and disabled, as we know now. And in around 1920, the Catholic Charities decided they needed the space back. So that's when we began our search for a new address. So then we moved, it seems like Pierpont, Montague, we're Court Street, we're all in the neighborhood. So now here we are. Next slide. This is 155, which was lovely. This is a shot by Ann Gaffney, a local artist. Many of you have bought her Christmas cards. That was a lovely spot, but I have to say, it was a little bit tucked away. You tell people about the wonderful things in the shop, and they'd say, well, where is it? And you say, 55 Pierpont. And they go, what? Where? I know people who lived in the neighborhood forever, and they never could find the shop. So that was their loss, I have to say. And so now there's no excuse for that. So I'm going to wrap this up. The next slide, please. Thanks to all of the wonderful volunteers who have kept this charity alive for the last 167 years. This is an archival shot from 2004. I know I was a member then because I'm in the picture, but I don't remember when I joined. As soon as I could talk my way into it, I joined. Yes, and the last slide. So yes, so I want to thank the Center for Brooklyn History, who I spent many hours, and thanks to you for coming, and St. Anne's for having us. This is the first time I've organized this information in any way, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Can I have this mic? Thank you.
Yes.
Why don't we give Martha a little hand before we take questions?
Oh, thank you. Oh, my
Gosh,
goodness. Oh, thank
okay.
you. Thank you.
Where's mine? No, just kidding. Can everyone hear me? This mic is is that okay? I see your hands. I want to do this in as easy a way as possible. Actually, it helps that I have this microphone that I can pass around. So I think I'll do that. I did just want to quickly say that as you talked about the migration, if you will, of the organization from place to place, it reminded me that St. Anne's, we are in the building that was once the Church of the Holy Trinity, and that, which was, the doors opened in 1847, so about the time that the Women's Exchange was beginning. But St. Anne's Church started in the 18th century down in what's Dumbo now, in the living room of Ann Sands, and then gradually to John Middog's barn, and then a few churches, and then up the hill down the street on Clinton until it moved in here in the late 60s. So we have that in common with you, migrating through the neighborhood, I guess, I want to say. But I also, as I looked at your website and did a little of my, some homework of my own, I made a couple of other connections to the fact that your operation depends so much on volunteerism, as does every church I know and every house of worship. That there were churches involved in the founding of the organization, or at least their efforts kind of led to the establishment of the institution. That you're the longest running volunteer, what is it? I wrote it down. The longest, where is it? Oldest continuously operated women's charitable organization in Brooklyn.
Wow, yeah.
That's a pretty amazing history, a bit of history. And it was also interesting to me that that on your website you say that women were found, they were offered this employment as an alternative to working in factories and other dangerous work environments. And I was reminded that in the coming week will mark the 112th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and how much that, granted that was much later in 1911, but how much that resonated with what the work of the Women's Exchange was. I think I'll stop there because I saw a lot of hands, but I just wanted to make some of those points. And who had their hand up first? Okay.
Martha, I'm just curious. You mentioned that when we were founded, that 11 men were involved. Were they considered like the owners of the business, or did
No, they were certainly not. The Women's Exchange, the women were the owners of the business, but
Okay.
they were advisors, and it was okay for the advisors. The women couldn't buy property,
Right.
so they bought the property in the name of the Female Employment Society.
And how were they related to the women who were running the business? Do you know?
I think
Were they
they
the
were part of the
husbands?
same social milieu, because it was a group of different people from all the major churches, and every year they appointed somebody who would shake down, get contributions from the parishioners, and they would be listed in a book from each different church, each church.
I've heard that there were and are other women's exchanges across the United States, and that there are just a handful left, and I'm wondering if you can comment on how they were the same, if they were ever connected, what the history is
Well,
there.
probably some of my fellow members could probably answer that better. I think there are 15 left. Ann can do that, and it's a whole combination of things.
So once upon a time, there were at least 200 Federation of Women's Exchanges that joined forces across the United States. Currently, there are 15 members of the Federation of Women's Exchanges. It's not women's, it's woman. And they are across 11 states at the moment. The Federation is trying very hard to maintain the number of members that we currently have, and look to see if there's a way for us to be able to have other women-run organizations, not-for-profit, join us. And that is part of the mission of the Federation at this moment in time.
Yes.
Martha, I have to say, this was totally fascinating. I didn't realize that the history started with the Civil War and, getting employment for women, but of course I'm curious, was that limited to just white women? Were other groups of women, this was Brooklyn, but still it's the Civil War, or even later? Was it limited, or was it, hey, you're a woman, you could come sell yourself?
I think it was women and men. They did employ men, but I don't think they were seamstresses. men made things, they needed men in their organizations, they needed men to help run their buildings, to, put coal in the food. And I don't think it was limited to white women, because I saw in one of the earlier publications in the Women's Exchange basement, it said that, that even though they helped 168 women like the first 6 months, and only 6 of them were Protestant, the rest were Catholic. And that could mean anything. If they let Catholics in, they would let anybody in, This was such a Protestant place, They would even let the Irish in, probably, who knows? But I did not see many Irish names, not in the administration, I have to tell you.
I don't know if you said how many craftspeople the Brooklyn Women's Exchange hosts, or
300, at least 300, up to 300, I would.
300 now, and I forgive me if I didn't hear exactly you talking about what I read as being described as the American crafts movement. As I was reading about the exchange, I thought of it as sort of the original Etsy. And then as I read more about, it seemed like everybody was calling it that, but is that a fair comparison, just in terms of?
No, not
okay,
at all.
Please.
Not at all.
The difference between Etsy and the Brooklyn Women's Exchange is that we are a not-for-profit organization that promote artisans and crafters. And Etsy is a for-profit. That's the first thing. The second thing is, you can't touch and feel Etsy. You can touch and feel all the things that are in our shop. So there's a big difference there. And finally, they're not volunteer run. We are.
That's a powerful comparison, yes. We'll take the last question.
Thank you. It's not really a question, Anne. The question just reminded me that the New York Times did a profile on us in 2015, in which they said, the subhead was, American Handcrafts in Brooklyn Before Etsy, like 100 years before Etsy.
150 years before Etsy. Yes.
Last question.
Hi, Martha. I know you're a volunteer-run organization. How challenging is it now? Because to be fair, most of the women that I meet in there are my age or older. What are you doing to bring in to continue this into the next century?
So you're a plant, right? They put you here. No, I'm kidding.
Here's my answer. Could some of the members of the Women's Exchange please stand up? And we have others on this side of the aisle. The answer to that question simply is that people find time. We have educators, we have college counselors, we have people in the financial industry, we have lawyers, we have a nurse, physicians, people from all walks of life who find time.
I'm afraid we will have to wrap up at least our official live stream, because our tech director has to be off very soon. So I just want to make one acknowledgement and offer one more round of thanks. This is sort of acknowledgement and thanks. I know how much the Kalfa brothers, the owners of Lassen Hennings and some properties in the neighborhood, I know how much their involvement, shall we say, and willingness to work with you, the difference it's made in terms of your finding and residing at your current location. I say that mostly from what I've read, and I wanted to acknowledge them. I only wish they were the Kalfa sisters, and that would have really just kind of brought it all home. But many of us know Thomas and Chris, and I don't know that I don't want to misrepresent anything, but I wanted to acknowledge that the role they played, if it meant something to all of you to mention them. Is that fair to say that they had a hand in your finding your current spot? So thanks to them, Thanks so much to you. God bless you all. Those of you who are volunteering for this magnificent organization, thank you for bringing to life a lot of the history so that we know you're not just another storefront, for reminding us that this is not an in the clouds in the cloud sort of experience that you're inviting us to have, but one that's tangible and interpersonal and one that's grounded in goodwill and good faith. You looked like you might want to say one more thing. I usually get the last word here, but you're going to get it today.
You sure? I just want to thank you all. That's number one. And number two is, while we don't have any Hoover dresses at the shop, we do have lots and lots and lots of beautiful handmade items. I would like to extend an invitation to all of you to come after this to our shop. We're serving mimosas and we have cookies, and we'd love to have you come over and take a look at us and be part of us. If anybody's interested in volunteering, please, please, our head of membership is right here, Christina Gonzalez. She'd be happy to talk to you. Thank you so much. And you can have the last word.
Well, I was asked to remind people of the address. It's 137 Montague. It is just a few doors down, storefronts down, if you exit on the Montague Street side through the Parish Hall. And I only will add that you just reminded me what else we have in common, which from the articles I've read, you guys like to throw a party, and so do we here at St. Anne's. So let's do that, more of this together, okay? Thank you all. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Oh, we did it.